Welcome to another edition of our treatment of the International Sunday School lesson plan. Today's lesson is Justice in Sabbath Laws. And it's taken from Matthew, the 12th chapter, verses 1 through 14. It's for the June the 3rd, 2018 summer quarter, lesson number 1. Now, a little background information. This is when during the time of Jesus, and him and his disciples are going through some fields of grain. They've had a long day. They're hungry, and they are going to pull some of the grain up and eat a reasonable amount as they go through. And the Pharisees are going to give them a hard time about it. Now, the Pharisees, a little quick background information about them. The Pharisees were actually the super religious conservative group during the time of Christ. And where they had actually came from is that there was a period of severe apostasy in the Old Testament, and the Pharisees are the descendants and came from the group that stood against that severe time of apostasy. And they had went along as time had grown and had gone on. They had disintegrated into this group that was lifeless and were really concerned about just the appearances of things and the tradition of things. And if you'll notice that John the Baptist and Jesus, they had most of their contentions with the Pharisees, who were the hyper-conservative group of the day, more so than the Herodians and the Sadducees, who were the more liberal people of the day. And it's not to say that the conservative groups are always in the wrong and liberals are always in the right. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that it is easy to gag at a gnat and swallow a camel, and to be so tied up with the intricacies and the finer points and miss the major points of the Bible. And that's really where we're talking about in today's lesson. Okay? Now, Matthew 12, 1 through 4. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." And he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, and it was not unlawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priest." So we see here how that Jesus and the disciples were going through the grain fields. And there was a provision in the law that said that if people went through the fields, that if they were hungry, they could eat as they went through the fields. And that was permissible. That was not considered stealing to go through somebody's fields. And if they had like an apple on their apple tree, and if they were hungry, they could pluck the apple. Now, if they went through the fields with a big bushel, and went and started plucking and hauling your produce off of your field, now that was stealing. But if they were hungry, they could pluck as they went through. And that's what Jesus and the disciples were doing. But it just so happens that this was the Sabbath. And that's where the Pharisees were trying to get Jesus on. And it's interesting to note that in the traditions of the Pharisees, they had decided that if a shepherd on the Sabbath, if one of his sheep got in trouble, that he was free to go and release the sheep and to rescue the sheep even on a Sabbath. But they did not put the same provisions if somebody was going to do that for a person. Okay? And Jesus points out that David, if you go back into Samuel and read the story, how that David was fleeing from Saul, and his men were hungry, and so he went to the priest and asked them to give some of the bread of the presents to his men. And there was not anything wrong, because this was an emergency, and this was an emergency for them to be given that bread. And even though technically, under normal circumstances, this would not have been permissible, but because it was an emergency, it was permissible. Okay? And Jesus was pointing that out to the Pharisees. Okay? 5th verse, or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priest in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? In other words, the priests work on the Sabbath day, and this is permissible for them to do. Okay? 6th and 7th verse, I tell you something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. Now, this is where Jesus is quoting, is where in the Old Testament prophets, where they had said that it's not the offerings, not the sacrifices that are the important thing, but loving mercy and tender-heartedness and caring about people. You know, this is something that it took me years and years to really come to appreciate. How that an ounce of love is worth more than a pound of right. How that sometimes we can be so tied up with the minuscule things and so heartless in how we deal with people that we're getting it wrong. It's more the love of God that we need to be focused on. More the charity, more the mercy, more the caring for people, more the tenderness that we need to be showing than the minuscule little rules that we have. I have seen people show so heartlessness toward people and show heartlessness in being so tied up on the minor rules and regulations that they are being so heartless toward people and show the lack of charity. The first and foremost things that we need to be concerned with and we need to be focused on is showing charity and love toward other people. And what Jesus was saying to the Pharisees, if they had understood what that means to show charity and mercy and kind-heartedness to people, that's more important than showing sacrifice and giving offerings and the minor parts of the law, they would not have condemned the disciples and Jesus. They would not have condemned the guiltless. And that is what we need to be focused on. Now, I want to be real clear about something. I'm not saying not to be concerned about the rules and regulations that we see in the Bible. I'm not saying we should not be concerned about that. I'm not saying that we should not be concerned about the rules and regulations in our various denominations. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that the number one concern, the number one focus of our life, the number one focus in how we deal with various situations should be from a place of love and charity and tender-heartedness and kindness and meekness and humility. That is how we should be focused and how we should, everything should spring from that focus and that center spot. And that is what today's lesson is really teaching us in our lives today. 20:8, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus Christ is the ruler over all things. 9 and 10. He went on from there and entered their synagogue. And a man was there with a withered hand. And they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So that they might accuse him. Now, oftentimes, when people are trying to drum up charges on other people, where they are jealous, they are wanting to bring them into condemnation, They are afraid this other person is getting ahead of them. They are having various, they're trying to drum up charges on people. They will look for those nitpicking things to accuse them. You can see where maybe people at a church will be trying to run a pastor off. They will look for any little thing that they can accuse that pastor of. Nitpicking little thing. Or maybe a pastor will have a deacon that he is jealous of the popularity of that deacon or somebody on his board, and they will try to drum up charges on that deacon. And doing that stems from works of the flesh, from pride, from wanting to be a big shot, and that is always sinful. And if you look hard enough, you can find reasons to accuse almost any one of us. A lot of your actions, a lot of our actions, a lot of my actions, a lot of your actions, you can look at things in different aspects. Something may seem completely reasonable, and something may be completely reasonable, but somebody can put a lot of different emphasis on things and make it look bad. And that is what they were doing here. The Pharisees were trying to drum up charges on Jesus, trying to figure out how they can accuse him of wrongdoing. Now here is a man, and in the other accounts it was his right hand that was withered. He could not use that right hand. That was a huge detriment to this man's life. It was a disability that significantly impacted this man's ability to for his livelihood, for him to be able to provide for himself, for the people he loved. And he had suffered with this withered hand. Now, the Pharisees did not care about this man. And as I had mentioned earlier, they even had in their rules where a shepherd could go out and tend to their sheep under an emergency situation on the Sabbath day. They had the tradition where the shepherd could do that. But they did not have the same condition, the same exception for somebody to go out and help another person. So, by their traditions, they had valued a sheep more than a person. Now, sometimes we have the same kind of mentality in our culture today. Now, I believe in being kind and gentle to your animals, to your pets, but sometimes it seems like some people will be more concerned about a pet and an animal and making sure they are not mistreated more so than a human person. In fact, you can hear some people that is mainly what they are more concerned about is the treatment of a pet. And please don't get me wrong. I've said it before. If you're in my neighborhood and it's 10 degrees out and you leave your short-haired dog out in the 10-degree weather and your dog comes up missing, you can look in my basement, because if I see your animal out roaming the streets, your short-haired animal in 10-degree weather, they're going to be in my basement. I'll let them in my basement and let them stay, because a short-haired dog don't like laying down in 10-degree weather no more than you would. And that's just flat cruel. I mean, I'm not trying to steal your dog, but I believe in taking, being gentle and kind to your animals. I do. But it is a lot more important for people, for kids, for children, for old people, to be cared for and be looked after than it is for an animal. And sometimes in our society, we have a tendency to be more upset with animals being mistreated than people. And people are worth more than an animal. It's like I've said about that gorilla that was shot. That gorilla had somebody's baby. This was maybe a couple of years ago at the zoo. Baby had gotten in with the gorilla, and the gorilla was dragging that baby, that young child, across at the zoo. And I've said it before, it would have taken me between breaths whether or not to shoot that gorilla. I mean, I felt sorry for the gorilla and all like that, but that was a human child getting dragged across that zoo. Now, you can deal with the parents for letting that baby out of their care later. But at the moment, it would have taken me between breaths to decide whether or not to shoot that gorilla, because the gorilla is not worth nothing compared to a human child. Doesn't matter if it was my grandbaby or your grandbaby. Human children are worth a lot more than any kind of animal. You let an animal come after a child, it doesn't take me between breaths, I can decide what my reaction is going to be. I'm going to protect a kid way quicker than I would some animal. Okay? And we need to be that way. We need to be really focused in on who we care about. We need to be caring about people over and above any type of anything else. People. We need to be tenderhearted toward people. And that's one of what Jesus is pointing out in these stories today. And this man who had the withered hand. Okay? 11 through 14, he said to them, "Which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Or how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him to destroy him. Okay? Now, let me just say a couple of concluding thoughts about all of this. And I really wanted to make sure that I say a few things in closing. First off, I am not saying, Jesus was not saying, the Bible does not say to ignore these finer points, to that it's all right to live any way you want to and just grin and smile at sin. That's not what we're saying. But what the Bible is saying, what Jesus is saying, and what I am repeating here today is that we need to be our number one focus should be on being gentle and tender-hearted and loving and be concerned about the needs of the people around us. Do not put anything above that of being tender-hearted and caring for the people around you. Well, friends, I will see you, good Lord willing, next time around.